Hello everybody, welcome to class. Just to make sure everybody here should be here for Chess Theory 101 with Professor Whale. If you are not, then this is the wrong classroom. Everybody good? Alright, let's get going. You should have already read and accepted the syllabus. If you have any questions, feel free to ask after class. This is the introductory class to chess theory, a field of study in Genshin Impact that is seemingly going to be ever present throughout the Tevat chapter and beyond. This class is a prerequisite for pretty much any speculative theory classes you might want to take in the future because of how core the symbolism of chess is to the story of Genshin. So today is going to be pretty much a cursory view of everything in the course, and I have a video for you guys to watch for today. Feel free to not take notes, you'll have the entire semester to cover everything in this video. Okay, so putting the professor shtick aside, chess theory, which isn't like some official name, that's just kind of what I like to call it, is a huge thing that keeps popping up in the most in front of our faces places, and it's really important to at least have a basic grasp on it since it is absolutely everywhere. I just find it funny that by calling it chess theory, it makes it sound like it's something you can get like a degree in or something, hence the joke in the first paragraph. So what is chess theory? Well, chess theory is a collection of theories and speculations that pertain to chess and its relation to Genshin Impact. For some reason, Hoyoverse really fixates over chess and chess pieces, so plenty of theorists across YouTube and Twitter have come up with a lot of really good theories surrounding Hoyoverse's use of chess-related symbolism. But because Hoyoverse uses chess so much, and because there have been so many different symbols related to it over history, it's kind of hard to find one definitive place to get caught up on what the leading interpretations are. So that's what this video intends to do, to catch anybody up on the current understandings of chess theory as of Chapter 3, Act 5 of the Archon quest. As a quick rundown of what will be covered, as well as a TLDR of what we understand as of now, each Gnosis is in the shape of a different chess piece from the back row of the chessboard. The only piece that we know for absolute certain is Zhongli's piece, which is a rook. Venti's piece is probably a queen, although there is very valid debate over whether or not that is true. A's piece is probably a bishop. We do not know the identity of the Dendro piece, although it is probably also a bishop. In A Winter's Night's Lazzo, yes, I'm still talking about that trailer, the board scene with Archon Gnosises is in the same configuration as the end of a very famous chess game, and the rest of the Tevat chapter might fall in line with the rest of those very famous chess games. So with that out of the way, let's get into each point. Right away, I want to make the disclaimer that I'm not some authority on chess. I have done research, I have a general understanding of chess as a game and the strategies that go into it, but I am nowhere near good at the game. Chess frustrates me. I am not good at visualizing things, which means I'm not good at really looking at the board and recognizing the patterns and visualizing where the game could go. So I have never been able to put very much time into it and get good at it. Instead, what I am good at is recognizing allegory and the like, so it will be possible that a lot of my analysis in this video will just be me talking out of my ass. If this is the case, then let me know in the comments because I am dumb. Considering this is a video about the basics, I'm going to cover literally all of my bases and start from the very beginning with what a Gnosis actually is. So a Gnosis in Genshin is a thing that each of the Archons possess. What the point, power, and significance of the Gnosis is still not fully understood. We know that each Gnosis does have a power to it that was kind of confirmed in Nahida's quest. As before, we only knew of one Gnosis that actually did something, that being Zhongli's. Zhongli's Gnosis was responsible for producing Mora, Tevat's currency, and now we know that Nahida's Gnosis was controlling Sumeru City's Akasha terminal, allowing people to access whatever information they wanted whenever, more or less. It was also later confirmed in the confrontation between Dottore and Nahida that all Gnosises have a power inherent to them, just that not all of them have a specific job that we know of. In the real world, the idea of a Gnosis comes from a pagan collection of beliefs that derived from Jewish and Christian sects, which eventually became known as Gnosticism. Clearly, there must be some sort of relation. Gnosis is the term used to refer to the true nature of humanity, as the word is the feminine word for knowledge or awareness. While this isn't really related to chess theory in any way, it's important to understand just as a basics kind of thing. Each of the 7 Archons possess one of the Gnosises, and each Gnosis resembles a different chess piece, specifically from the back row of a chessboard. I really shouldn't have to explain chess because it's literally the oldest board game humanity still plays, but I'm going to do it anyway for the sake of extending this video. This is a chessboard. This is the back row where all of the interesting pieces go. This is the front row, which is filled with pawns that can become any piece, most notably a queen, if one reaches the other side of the board. Pawns can move 1 or 2 spaces forward if it is their first move, and only 1 space for each subsequent move. They can capture pieces that are catty-corner to them, and can do this really dumb thing called an en passant, which is so obscure, just don't worry about it, but it looks like this. The back row of the board is where literally all of the strategic depth of chess comes from, as every piece is different in how it moves. Rooks go in either corner and can move laterally in any direction for as many spaces as it has room to, and can do this really neat thing called castling. If the rook has a direct line of sight to the king, it can move to where the king currently is, and moves the king 1 place in the direction in which the rook came. It's hard to explain, but it looks like this. The knight is a piece that can disregard any obstacles that may be in its way. It can move either 3 places forward or backwards, then 2 places left or right, or vice versa. The bishop is the diagonal version of the rook, being able to move diagonally any number of spots. The queen can move any direction, any number of spaces, and the king is the win condition. It can move 1 spot in any direction. If the king is put into a situation where it is 1 move away from being captured, it is called check. A player must either move the king out of check, move a piece in the way of the check, or capture the piece that is holding check in the next turn. If one player is able to set their pieces in a way that will keep the other player in check no matter what move they make, that is called checkmate, and the player who's holding checkmate automatically wins the game. Hopefully, all of you knew most of that, but I can never know. So each gnosis resembles a different chess piece. This was originally just a, hey, look at the 2 gnosises we've seen up to this point. They kind of look like chess pieces, don't they? Kind of theory, but was confirmed when the trailer A Winter's Night's Lazzo was released, as we can see Piero literally using the gnosises the Fatui had captured up to that point as pieces on a chessboard. Be forewarned, this trailer is like one of the core sources for chess theory. So by version 1.2, we had seen both the Animo and Geonosises. At the time, we had posited that the Animo Gnosis was the queen and the Geonosis was a rook. Notice how the Geonosis is very angular, square, and has these little bits that are reminiscent of Merlin's on a castle wall. It also makes sense if we take a look at Zhongli and the role of Geo. Zhongli is a very passive, defensive, and straightforward person and ruler. The rook is the most defensive piece on the board, being able to castle and often taking design hints from castle walls, which are defensive structures. The Animo Gnosis being a queen comes from the design, which has the crown without the cross, that looks a whole like the crown of a standard queen piece on a chessboard. Notice how Venti is also free-spirited, flexible, and independent, much like the queen piece, which can move in any direction for however far it pleases. That is the foundation of chess theory. That's where it all started. As the versions went on and we started to learn more about how both gnosises worked and what they did, we started to build on this theory bit by bit. Chess has, for a very long time, been seen as the most complex game or the most beautiful game or whatever. It's a game that has an insane number of possible permutations and has a strategic complexity that many other games could only wish to achieve. Its complexity is also staggering when you look at its relative simplicity. There are 9 types of pieces that you need to be familiar with and the things that they can do. And while there are a few edge cases and weird rules here and there, such as the en passant or castling, it's a rather straightforward and elegant game. The only game that really outdoes chess in both simplicity and complexity is Go. Because chess is seen as such a complex game, for the longest time it was posited that only humans could play it. This view only became more relevant when computers started to get faster and smarter, and for a long time, the chess community insisted that it would be impossible to teach a computer how to play chess. In comes a team of computer scientists and electrical engineers at IBM, whose goal it was to build a computer that could play chess and solve the game of chess. The story of Deep Blue, the first computer that could consistently play chess and beat a grandmaster in tournament setting, is fascinating. And if you would like a really deep look into the history and the monumental achievement that was Deep Blue, check out this video by Frederick Knudsen. It's a really good watch. I think I said his name right. I can never know. Anyway, IBM made a computer that could play chess, and nobody really believed it. Previously, Deep Blue's predecessor, Deep Thought, played the at-the-time world champion of chess, Garry Kasparov, and lost horribly. They played 2 games, and while Deep Thought wasn't bad, it wasn't good either, being controlled the entire time by Kasparov during both games. Deep Blue's team challenged Kasparov again, and Kasparov and Deep Blue played a series of 6 games this time. Kasparov ended up winning 4-2, but Deep Blue did win 2 matches, being the first ever computer to beat a reigning world champion in tournament setting. Humans were at the verge of losing to machines in a territory that was always considered to be the domain of human creativity. So why do I tell this story? Well, it's important to mention because in the trailer, A Winter's Night's Lazzo, where we see all of the Fatui gather in Snezhnaya for La Signora's funeral, we see Pierrot, the leader of the Harbingers, playing, or at least observing, a game of chess. Shortly after the release of this trailer, people noticed that the board is in the exact same position as the end of Game 1 of Deep Blue versus Garry Kasparov that took place in 1996. What's even crazier is that the move that we see played, knight to f7 to capture the black pawn, is exactly the move that lost Kasparov the game. Before this, Kasparov was 1 move away from winning, moving his rook here to put Deep Blue's king into checkmate. But the move we see white play put Kasparov into check, forcing him to play defensively, which Deep Blue was able to capitalize on. But what turns this board state from being a little Easter egg to chess fans to being something that we can base our interpretation of the game on is the fact that a pyro crystal fly, which in this case represents Signora, lands on the black pawn that was just captured, thus drawing a direct symbolic parallel between this game that we see being played on the chessboard and the events of Genshin Impact. And this right here is the core of chess theory. If the pieces in their ties to the gods they represent is the foundation of chess theory, the parallels between Kasparov's battle for humanity and Genshin's story is the core. In the past, people like Ashikai have theorized that the game we see in Winter Night's Lazzo, Game 1 of Deep Blue versus Kasparov, represents Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma chapters of the Archon Quest, and Game 2 represents Sumeru. But I actually have a different interpretation that I'm going to take the chance to exposit here because it's actually really cool. Commonly, the games between IBM's computer systems and Garry Kasparov are given the nickname The Battle for Humanity. It seems a bit overdramatic now, but at the time it was a serious deal to see a computer that could do something that we thought only humans could do at the highest of levels. The nickname is important because it plays into the allegory. When we look at the games that Kasparov played, we can assume that in every case, Kasparov represents the Fatui, who are fighting for humanity, and the AI represents Celestia. In both cases, Kasparov against IBM's machines and the Fatui against Celestia, there is a battle for humanity going on. So at a much more symbolic level, Kasparov represents humanity as a whole, and white represents Celestia, or humanity's oppressors. The more astute of you may have noticed that I mentioned a few games that occurred before Deep Blue played Kasparov for the first time in 1996. Deep Blue's predecessor, Deep Thought, played 2 games against Kasparov in 1989. These games are notable because Kasparov absolutely kicked Deep Thought's ass. In both games, Deep Thought started off alright, kind of at the level of a mid-level chess player or so, but soon made blunder after blunder, losing board control consistently until Kasparov had Deep Thought under his heel. So my theory goes like this. What if instead of Game 1 of Deep Blue versus Kasparov representing Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma, what if Games 1 and 2 of Deep Thought versus Kasparov represented Mondstadt and Liyue respectively, and Deep Blue's first game represents Inazuma by itself? Well, let's look at the games and you'll get to see the kind of allegory we're talking about here. If we're basing off the assessment that Deep Thought's first game represents the prologue of Genshin Impact, the Mondstadt chapter, let's keep an eye on the queen, because that is what Venti's piece looks like. So the actual game starts off very back and forth, with Deep Thought, who is playing white here, holding a very small statistical advantage. It doesn't really do much with it though, and Kasparov slowly takes the time and space that Deep Thought gives him to build his pieces into a really good place. The game remains rather even until this move here, move 37, where Deep Thought probably should have moved its king here in a more protected position, but instead moves its queen really far up in a very aggressive fashion, which Kasparov maneuvers around. Deep Thought continues to be weirdly aggressive, moving its pawns forward, until it moves its king back into an exposed position, instead of moving the queen back into a defensive position. After a few more moves of not doing what it needed to, Deep Thought loses its queen in a trade, which allowed Kasparov to punish Deep Thought and end the game. So here Kasparov plays very slowly and patiently, using the space that Deep Thought is giving him to set up a proper attack. And once Deep Thought makes some really dumb moves, such as bringing a queen way too far forward, he goes in for the kill. This parallels directly with the start of Genshin. The Fatui are playing slow and quiet. They're just spreading across Teyvat, implanting themselves in everyday life, getting their pieces set up to where they need to be, until Venti, the queen, shows himself in a too far forward of a position and gets his queen taken by the Fatui, ending game 1. Okay, so now let's look at game 2, where instead of focusing on the queen, let's focus on the black rooks, as Deep Thought is playing black here, and see what they do. Game 2 of this series is, admittedly, much less interesting. Deep Thought plays somehow worse, Kasparov plays better, so on. Deep Thought makes a lot of really dumb moves that breaks its backline wide open, such as moving its queen to f6 on move 13 instead of doing literally anything else, allowing Kasparov to just waltz right in, forcing Deep Thought's queen into a position where he could trade it for a bishop. And while Deep Thought continues to fruitlessly try and aggress Kasparov's king, Kasparov just keeps the pressure on, forcing more and more mistakes out of Deep Thought. We eventually arrive at move 31, where Deep Thought pushes a bishop back to try and do something, which Kasparov takes to pull Deep Thought's knight out of the way of the king, allowing him to push his rook up and put the king into check. Here, finally, Deep Thought's rook does something, as both of Deep Thought's rooks haven't moved for the entire game up to this point, taking Kasparov's rook and alleviating pressure. But that rook is then captured by Kasparov's queen, which puts Deep Thought back into check, forcing it to retreat, effectively cornering itself. A few more moves and Deep Thought resigns. Note here that at the end of the game, only one rook was captured, Zhongli's rook. The other rook is out there somewhere still. We don't know who has it, but somebody has to have it. This game is characterized by Deep Thought kind of just being too aggressive. It just kept forgetting that it had a king to defend and kept trying to put Kasparov into check when there was more pertinent things to worry about. What definitely hasn't changed though is that Deep Thought in both of these games was on its back foot and never had a chance. Kasparov went into both games calm and confident, like he was playing just a regular opponent, and won both games. Now if we parallel that to Genshin, during the first 2 chapters, Celestia and the Archons have been on the back foot the entire time. The Fatui are taking offensive steps time and time again, first catching Venti while he's off guard, and second while Child breaking into the Golden House to steal the Gnosis straight up. Celestia has to play reactionary. And while that doesn't work, and Zhongli ends up resigning the Gnosis rather early, just like Deep Thought resigned this game a few moves away from checkmate, it still forced Zhongli into a corner where he had to sign away his Gnosis to the Tsaritsa. So the main reason I bring these 2 games up is to 1, give us an understanding of what we're dealing with, and 2, to give us a little practice in what we're about to get into, because those games are, as far as we know, actually completely unrelated to the game as a whole. We haven't ever seen these games referenced anywhere before, and I purely think they might have a relation to the game because it makes the pattern of one chess game to one chapter all nice and neat. But with Inazuma, we are talking about a game that actually does get explicitly referenced by Hoyoverse, so it gets much, much more interesting. The trailer A Winter's Night's Lazzo came out on June 10th, 2022, which was quite a while after we saw La Signora die in the Inazuma Archon quest. If you are curious about a full breakdown of the trailer, I have a video on it from shortly after the trailer itself came out that you can watch. But what we're mostly interested in this trailer is the chessboard that appears at the beginning that Piero is standing over. I should point out that it is unclear if he is actually playing the game or not for reasons that I will get into later, but it is something that I need to point out because I got into a debate with Ashikai over this point, and yeah, it's dumb. So from the first few shots of the board that we get, we can identify this board as being the same state as moves 34 and 35 of Game 1 of the 1996 match between Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov. The general rule of analysis holds strong for now. Kasparov is playing black, and that represents the Fatui, and Deep Blue was playing white, which is Celestia. This game is notable mostly because it's the first game with the new and improved computer Deep Blue. Deep Blue was a huge step up in both design and processing power, and so going into this game, IBM had way more confidence in their ability to defeat Kasparov. Granted, Deep Blue is nowhere near a perfect chess machine. It actually is not good whatsoever. Chess algorithms today could defeat Deep Blue handily, even on medium difficulty, but it was still pretty decent for its time. So before we actually start to look at the game as a whole, I want to say that my analysis of this game is not mine. The series of games is one of the most studied games in the history of chess. So for that reason, I have taken a lot of analysis from other people, most notably analysis provided by Gotham Chess, who made a phenomenal video on a few of these games. So if you want a more detailed analysis, check that video out, link is in the description. The beginning of this game starts off rather normal, just some pawn development, and Deep Blue decides to take a pawn, which allows Kasparov to trade with his queen. It's kind of weird, especially in 96, to open with a queen this early, but it's not so strange as to throw Deep Blue's algorithm off. In fact, Kasparov bringing his queen out this early was kind of a mistake in the long run, because Deep Blue capitalizes off of this. After a bit of development, Deep Blue uses its knight to chase down the queen, pushing Kasparov back and forcing the king to castle, which sets up the end of the game. From there, the game continues to develop as normal, just trading and developing their lines. The next interesting move comes from move 25, where instead of capitalizing on an investment made earlier on in the game, Deep Blue instead opts to develop its pawns further, getting them further out of the way. This then causes Kasparov to move his king back once more and into a corner. Again, a bunch of moves, and then we get to this board state after move 32. Here, Kasparov is gearing up to punch his rook to the other side of the board, putting the pressure onto Deep Blue's king, forcing checkmate. But right before he does, note that Deep Blue takes its remaining knight to d6. Keep this guy in mind, this will change the game entirely. So Kasparov does end up pushing with his rook, forcing Deep Blue to push its king back into this little enclave of pawns that it made. Kasparov then moves his knight to f2 to cover the rook for when it goes in, forcing checkmate. If this knight was not here, then checkmate wouldn't happen. So at this point in the game, Kasparov is literally one move, rook to h1, away from checkmate. So how does Deep Blue respond to this? Does it further try to defend its king? No, it actually plays knight to f7. This move captures one of Kasparov's pawns as well as puts his king into check. Due to the rules of chess, Kasparov has to act on this check in order to continue playing, and so he opts to move his king, which takes the pressure off of Deep Blue. Deep Blue then proceeds to chase Kasparov's king with its knight, further keeping Kasparov from playing aggressive and winning the game. Ultimately, Deep Blue continues using its really well-placed pieces to keep Kasparov playing defensive, eventually winning Deep Blue the game. Kasparov was one move away from winning, but because of one slip-up, because of one oversight, he let one move slip that forced him into playing defensive, losing the game. I have a feeling that you can probably guess how this lines up to the game itself, and the visuals of A Winter's Night's Lazzo really nails this in the head. In the trailer, we see the single move that loses Kasparov the game, knight to f7, being played on the board. After this move, which knocks a black pawn down, we see the Pyro Crystal Fly, a direct stand-in for La Signora, land on the pawn. This, in combination from the fact that any color played by Kasparov represents the Fatui, means that this pawn probably represents La Signora and how her death in Inazuma was very much not a part of the plan, causing the Inazuma front of the Fatui's plan to pretty much be considered a loss. Yes, they did capture a Gnosis, which we know is probably a bishop, we'll cover that later, which are pieces that are entirely absent by this point of the game, but they lost one of their ranks, which is a huge loss. It's something that forced them into meeting together to recuperate from, which is something that hasn't happened in a very long time according to the video's description. So even though the Fatui captured the Gnosis in the end, they still lost a key player in their plans, which puts them behind and marks the first game in which Celestial won. However, it should be noted that this win is purely because of a slip-up, or a right piece being in the right place at the right time. The knight gets a cheeky capture, and then the game is lost. So that begs the question, what does the knight represent in this move? Well, there are two theories. Before we actually got to see the Electro-Gnosis, we thought that the knight represented the Raiden Shogun, as she is the one that strikes down Signora in the end. But after we saw the Electro-Gnosis, which is very much not a knight, which again we'll talk about, it makes more sense if we consider this knight piece the Traveler, who is also an honorary knight. That last point is kind of on the nose, but it does drive the point home that the knight piece here is probably representative of the Traveler. Think about it. In the Inazuma story, the Shogun doesn't actually really do all that much to kill Signora. Yeah, she's the one that does deal the final killing blow, but the Traveler is the one that wins the duel, and the Shogun is just following through on the terms of the duel that the Traveler and Signora agreed upon beforehand. And the winner of that duel was the Traveler, so overall, the Traveler is the one that actually played the move that cornered the Fatui and forced them out of Inazuma. One final detail that I want to point out about this trailer and the board we see in it is that it is identical to the board during move 34, except for one detail. The kings and the queens are swapped. At this point of the game, the queens were both in the middle of the board vying for control in that area. But if we look at the wide shot of the board during the trailer, we see that instead of the queens in the middle of the board, we see both of the kings, with Venti's queen piece in place of Deep Blue's king. This is a detail I genuinely have no idea how to interpret, and I don't think really anybody else has come up with a good explanation for it that I've seen. Literally every single piece is in the correct position, including Zhongli's rook, except for the queens and the kings. The only interpretation that makes any sense to me is the fact that for some reason, in Teyvat, the role of the kings and the queens are swapped, and that the queens are the win condition. We have no way of knowing really because we never actually seen a queen play in any capacity. It is something that we do have to keep an eye on in the future though. So all of this discussion about the knight and it being captured leaves one question. What pieces are the other Gnosises? So we have two that we know for absolute certain. Zhongli is the rook and Venti is the queen. And at the end of the 3.2 Archon quest, we actually get to see a solid look at the Inazuma Gnosis, which was something that was strangely absent from the actual Inazuma Archon quest. When Nahida finally took the Gnosis from the grubby hands of Mr. Mommy Issues, we got to see that it wasn't a knight as was theorized for so long. There are a few reasons we know it's not a knight. The biggest reason is the fact that knights in chess are synonymous with horses. Even in chess sets that are themed off other IPs, the knight is very, very rarely anything other than a horse or something adjacent, and it would make no sense for Hoyoverse to break this norm when horses are a staple of Japanese history. A major argument for the Gnosis still being a knight is that it takes design hints from the samurai, and the samurai are just the knights of feudal Japan. However, horses were a staple of Japanese combat and are the reason why samurai were so deadly. So there would literally be no historical reason for Hoyoverse to not make a knight a horse. So then what is it? Well, it's most likely a bishop, as I stated earlier. The design just doesn't really line up with anything else. The curves and the slim base with the ornate top that doesn't resemble anything else on the board kind of slots it really well into a bishop role. That also makes sense if we look at the playstyle of the bishop and A as a character. Bishops are particularly useful towards the end of a chess game and usually stay back and vibe and watch for opportunities to either break an attack or punch through into the back of the board with its long range and diagonal movement. If we look at how A behaves in the game, that's exactly what we see her do. In the majority of the Archon quest, A is completely absent for the most part, hanging back and just protecting the government of Inazuma until Senora shows up and completely dishes out a devastating move to the Fatui, which, yes, I know it goes against the point I made earlier about the knight, but I'm just demonstrating a point. This isn't something that's demonstrated in the actual games. And we can use this playstyle to figure out another Gnosis identity, Nahida's Gnosis, which is probably also a bishop for multiple reasons. But let's just start with a thought process we're already on. The bishop hangs back for most of the game until towards the end, where it can be used to push and punish the opponent. This is exactly what happens to Sumeru. Nahida cannot help us in our fight until the very end, where she makes some crazy bargains with Dottore, gaining a significant amount of leverage against one of the most powerful harbingers by erasing all of his aspects in exchange for a Gnosis. We can also guess that the bishop is Nahida's Gnosis because the bishop is often seen as a creative, cunning, and intelligent piece. You really have to know how to play a bishop to be able to use it well, and from my research, the bishop has some of the most depth to it strategically out of most of the pieces on the board. Now, that isn't to say that all the other pieces are Ooga Booga Gorilla Brain Go Chess, but they definitely aren't quite as situational and specialist as bishops are. And that right there kind of describes A and Nahida. They aren't very powerful, but they sure as hell are situational and really good in the right circumstances. So let's wrap up this incredibly long lecture by continuing the pattern that I posited earlier in the script and look at Game 2 of Kasparov versus Deep Blue and see if it correlates with the Sumeru Archon quest. So right away, if you look at this game, you will notice that it is much longer than the other games we have looked at, clocking in at a whopping 73 moves. This, even for professional chess, is extremely long, as most professional games run around 40 or so moves. Even the last game that we looked at ended in 37 moves. This is because in this game, Kasparov opted for taking a much more long-term, slow strategy to this game, possibly because he recognized that Deep Blue was much better at aggressive play and had a hard time analyzing long-term games because that definitely was a weakness of Deep Blue. The biggest hurdle that the engineers working on Deep Blue had was the fact that chess games get exponentially more complex for every subsequent move you try to calculate. So Deep Blue could only calculate so many moves into the future, and the further it tried to calculate into the future, the less confident it became in those predictions. So because of that, this game is long, which, and I doubt this is the case, but I still want to point it out, is funny because the Sumeru Archon quest is notorious for being very long. But anyways, I'm not going to cover this entire game, but some major footnotes to cover. Kasparov is white and Deep Blue is black. I think really the first interesting thing that happens in this game happens on move 19, where Kasparov moves his pawn up, Deep Blue takes that bishop, which allows Kasparov to take a knight on black's king side of the board, trading a bishop for a knight and Deep Blue's pawn structure, leaving its board open to infiltration and disruption. This diagonal line of pawns here might seem neat and like a good defensive line to somebody who doesn't know chess like myself, but it's actually not, because it allows Kasparov's bishop here to move in and be uncontested, taking either a pawn at h7 or f7, whichever he chooses. What's interesting about this board state is that Kasparov is playing so passive that Deep Blue is seemingly giving up its resources to try and get a little bit of action out of Kasparov. But Kasparov doesn't budge. He just keeps shuffling, taking trades, and baiting more important pieces out. Look here at move 32. Kasparov's rook here is taken by Deep Blue's dark bishop, which might seem useful taking a rook out of the game, but that is actually a really bad place for a bishop to be. In a game where there is one bishop on each side of the board and they are on opposite color tiles, it's considered a draw between those bishops because they can't actually affect each other since they are on different colored tiles and can't switch to the other colored tile. That's just the definition of bishops. But in some cases, having tied bishops gives the attacker an advantage, since the defending bishop can't actually do anything to counter against the attacking bishop. What also makes things worse is that this bishop is completely separate from the queen, unable to work with her and make anything happen. So after this move, Gary really ramps up his slow game play, using both his queen and his bishop to slowly chip away at Deep Blue's defense until he eventually gets the win. Notice that there is a bit of parallelism here, where the black queen and bishop are unable to coordinate and work together, whereas the white queen and bishop are able to slowly chip away at the defenses, winning white the game. If we look at the game in the context of the Archon quest, it lines up really well. In this context, we can assume that Nahida is the black bishop, as Deep Blue was black in this game, and Scaramouche represents the white bishop, as he had a bishop at the time, and Dottore is the queen because that just makes sense. Nahida was literally unable to do much during the game, unable to help defend the Gnosis from the fuckery that Scaramouche and Dottore were doing in the background. That fuckery represents the slow chipping away at defenses that Dottore and Scaramouche were doing in the background, dismantling faith in Nahida, getting into the highest levels of the academia, so on. Dottore was playing a long game with this Gnosis, and it ended up really good for him, as he walked away with 2 Gnosises, an indisputable win for Dottore in the Fatui. So if the pattern holds, what can we determine about the next chapter? Well, the most notable part of Game 3 is that it results in a draw. I'm not going to break Game 3 down here because this video is getting way longer than I expected it to get, but I still think that it's important to know that it resulted in a draw because that implies a very even trade in resources between Celestia and the Fatui in the next chapter. I don't think a Gnosis will be traded in the next chapter. I think we'll have the jump on somebody, but I do think something else will be lost for us, and that will set us back one game. We'll have to see, and I'm excited to see what may come of it. Alrighty, I think I heard the bell ring. That's about it for this lecture. This is a point of study in the Genshin lore community that is always developing and ongoing, and it's seen as one of my favorites. The allegory here is so cool and is something I've never actually seen done before in any other story. And it's hard to believe that we're reading into something Hoyoverse didn't intend, because they so transparently gave us that hint in A Winter's Night's Lazzo that pointed us towards this allegory, and it's so fun to read this allegory. Anyways, that's all I have for y'all today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Hopefully the next video will not be this long. Bye-bye.